Thomas and Merla. But this was the first time I wrote a big novel in English. And I suppose what we'll do this morning is I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I became a writer and why I became a writer. And then I'll read a little bit from the book, and then we'll talk a bit about, for those of you who've read the book and those of you who haven't read the book, we'll talk a bit about the characters and the setting. So is that okay? We can manage that? Alright. Well, I should say to start with, I'm from Galway. My father had a paint shop in Market Street and we lived upstairs. So I was always kind of steeped in Galway. And I grew up in the middle of town. Next door to us was an undertaker. We used to play in the coffins. So it was a very kind of mixed childhood. And before that, we moved into town when I was about 10. And just before that, I went to school in Castlegar, in Castlegar, which was all Gaeilge at the time. The school was all in Irish. My mother had gone to school there before me, and I went to school. And when I was training to be a teacher, they said that the most important time in your life are your first 5 years, and that's when everything sort of gets decided, or a lot of things get decided. Now in my case, in my first 5 years, I was born to very young parents. I had 5 sisters and no brother, which was great. And my father got very spoiled. And we didn't have much money, so we didn't buy an awful lot of books, but we discovered the library very early on, and we kind of lived in the library. When I was 5, my mother also decided that we would go to the school in Castlegar, which was all Irish, and that was going to have a huge effect on everything that happened to me after that. Because in that school, we weren't allowed to speak English. A bit like the Gael Scotland now, but much stricter. We really weren't allowed to speak English. And when I went to school there, that area of Galway still was a Brac Gaeltacht. A lot of the families who came to school didn't have English, they spoke Irish at home. We spoke English at home. And when we started in junior infants, because we didn't have any Irish, and we had a lovely teacher who was coming up to retirement age, and she told us that if we didn't know how to say it in Irish, to come up and say to her, "Cogger i the chluas," a whisper in your ear. And we would go up and we would say the words in English and she would tell us how to say it in Irish. And that's how worried they were that there would be any Irish, or any English rather. So there was an awful lot of Irish. And the other thing in that school was there were 3 teachers, and they were all elderly at that stage. They were coming up to retirement age. 2 of them had taught my mother. And we didn't have any indoor plumbing. The toilet was out in the backyard. There was no flush. There was no running water. There was no heat. There was an open fire in the classroom, and some of the children would bring turf in for the fire. So it was like going back in time. We lived that life until I was 10 in that school. And yet, I would say, we didn't lose out at all. The 3 teachers we had were great storytellers and great singers. And we knew loads of poems and songs and stories. And some of the stories that I learned there when I was in 1st and 2nd class, I ended up learning a second time when I went to university. And I studied Old Irish. And it was really strange to hear the professor talking about a story that I knew from when I was about 8 years old. So that was a huge influence on me because I had all of that stuff. And then I moved from there into town. And this is where, shock horror, I moved into the nuns. Now, we had, the first year I went into school, we had the crossest nun on the planet. I'd say she was certified. There was probably a framed thing on the wall that said, "This is the crossest teacher ever." So I want you to remember when I'm talking about this, that most teachers are lovely and smiley and nice, like your teachers. This one was an exception. Excuse me if my French is not back. Now, so this one was an exception. She was a nun and she was terrifying. So we were, Julie, terrified. And I, as I told you, was living in Market Street over the shop. And one weekend, my friend Teresa and I went out the Dyke Road, which was the countryside to us, and there I saw a white pony in a field. And I said to Teresa, "I wish that was my pony." And Teresa said, "Don't be ridiculous, you live over a shop, you have no garden, how could you have a pony?" So, I didn't care. All weekend I was thinking, if I had a pony, what would I do? So when I was in school on Monday, as luck would have it, the nun said, "Does anybody here have a pet?" And so we said, "I have a dog, sister. I have a cat, sister." And I said, "I have a pony, sister." And Teresa beside me went pale and said, "Now we're dead." And the nun said, "You have a pony? You live over a shop, you don't have a garden, how could you have a pony?" And I said, "We have a field on the Dyke Road. Now you'll notice at this stage I was also very good at telling lies. So she said, a field. And I said, yes. And she said, with her laser eyes, she said, you didn't have a pony on Friday. And I said, aha. But on Saturday, my cousin in Dublin fell off her horse, broke her back, and is in a wheelchair forever and ever, and I got the pony. And Teresa looked like she was going to faint. And the nun said, oh my God, we must pray for your poor cousin in Dublin. So she was praying for her. Now, when we were going home from school, Teresa said to me, we are dead now, because the nun tomorrow is going to kill you when she finds out. I said, you don't understand about teachers. They forget everything when they go home. They sit down, they have their dinner, they watch Coronation Street, they go to bed, and it's all over. We came into school in the morning, and the first thing that happened was the head nun came in, like a huge ship in her black dress. She came in the door and she said, where is the child with the cousin who fell off her horse, broke her back, and is in a wheelchair forever and ever? I said, that'll be me, sister. And she said, you poor thing. We'll get the whole parish to pray for her. I will ring the priests. So off she went. And from then on, it just got worse. Every day the nun would say to me, how's your cousin? And I foolishly would say, she's a bit worse, sister. Until finally I was saying, yes, she's very bad, sister. I'd say she'll die. Things were getting quite heated. So, the Saturday after that, I'm uptown with my mother on Eglinton Street. And who do we see across the road? The nun. And she came across and she said to my mother, Mrs. Forde, how is your poor niece? And my mother said, niece? And the nun said, you know, the one who fell off the horse, broke her back, is in a wheelchair forever and ever. And my mother said, no, I'm an only child. I don't have a niece. And the nun turned to me and she said, you are a liar. And my mother said, no, sister, she's not actually. She just has a big imagination. Now, you know with mothers, when there's somebody else there, and they're all nice and smiling, and then the minute the nun went, my mother turned into Dracula. What are you telling the nuns lies for? And it was she said to me, if you're going to make up stories, write them down. So the first story I ever wrote was about a pony called Mandy, and a girl whose cousin fell off the horse, broke her back, was in a wheelchair forever and ever, and the other girl got the horse. So you see, first of all, if you want to be a writer, start lying better than you're doing at the minute. You have to up your game. Because writing is very like lying. When you're writing, if you don't convince the reader that what you're saying is the truth, they won't believe you. And then if they don't believe you, they won't keep reading. Although I would say the lying thing gets difficult. I'd stay out of it. If you could, just lie on paper. Make up things for yourself on paper. So that was the nuns. I went to school there. I also met some great nuns in secondary school. We had a nun called Sister Albie who taught me Irish and Latin. And she loved literature and loved stories and got us reading stuff that we shouldn't have been reading at all. That was way too old for us. But she got us addicted to books. And I had another lovely English teacher called Mrs. Wordsmith who used to get us to write stories. And I really enjoyed all of that. And when I went into the nuns first, because I was coming from a country school, I spoke Irish, I had brown bread sandwiches, and I wore boys' shoes, girls, boys' shoes. Because my mother thought they were more serviceable. They'd last longer. So when I went into school first, I was bullied a bit by the girls. But after a while, things kind of settled down. And I ended up in 5th class buying The Facts of Life from Muriel Small around the back of the school. Muriel was selling them. I think they were maybe 10 pence or something each at the time. I could only afford one. I bought the first one, and he was kissing, apparently. But that was the kind of thing we were doing then. And again, my mother intervened and sent me down to the Tithe Yard. Do you know the Tithe Yard? Yeah. The Irish Language Theatre. They sent me down there when I was about 10 or 11 to act in the pantomimes. And I think the idea was that I'd keep my Irish up because everybody there was talking in Irish. So I was in lots of plays there. And even though I wasn't thinking it at the time, I was hearing lots of great stories because every play was a great story. So all those stories were going into my head and I really enjoyed that. And I did a lot of acting there. And I met a lot of mad and interesting people. But I do remember when I started there when I was about 11 or 12, I used to be in the dressing room which we shared. Women and girls were all in one dressing room. Now the boys needn't listen to this bit, this is really for the girls. But my biggest problem was I really wanted a bra and I didn't have one. So that was kind of awkward. Everybody else had one. But I stole my sister's and I went into the dressing room, delighted. I pulled off my jumper, and this woman who was there, she was an actress, but she was also a teacher, she came over to me and she said, "You're supposed to wear it under your vest." So my life in the Thai Park was quite checkered, but I kind of grew up there. And I learned a lot of things, apart from that very important thing. I learned all kinds of things while I was there. And I still haven't really written much, or done much of that. I went to college and I did Old Irish and English, and like I told you, I already used some of the stories. And I had a great time there because I didn't do much work, I didn't go to many lectures, because we had a great drama society and a Cumann Dromiachta, and I did lots of plays. And I wrote my first play when I was there. It was a play about Bráinne Whale, the pirate. Now, it's not that I had a big ego. I wrote the play, I took the main part myself, and I got my best friend to direct it, to make sure that I got the main part. So there was a lot of showing off going on. So I was in college for 3 or 4 years, not doing an awful lot of work, but doing loads of plays. And I was really lucky, because just at that time, Galway was about to explode. There was a fella called Ollie Jennings, set up the Galway Arts Festival, and Pádraig Brennan set up Mockness, and with Ollie, together, they created this mad world where they were making things and building things and bringing in plays from all over the world. So there were more and more stories for us to hear. And they were doing a lot of stuff out of doors, free. And I was really impressed with what they were at. And in the 1980s, they brought a group from Barcelona called Els Comedians. And they were like devils. So we went down at night in the dark, down around Middle Street, which at the time there was a lot of broken down buildings and yards. And out of the dark came all these little devils, throwing like little fireworks at us. And you could smell gunpowder. And it was crazy. Gangs of people on the street. And we were so impressed. So when they left town, Mockness in Galway decided they could do something like that. And they started building things like the big dragon for the parade. And I was asked to come in and help write some of the stories for the parades. Because even the parade had to have a story. And it was the first time I ever built a world out of nothing. The idea for one parade was the land beneath the sea, Tirpuhin. And we built that whole world in our imagination. We spent a whole winter meeting, 3 or 4 of us, talking about what would be in the world under the sea. And we thought that maybe the north wind lived down there in a cave. And we thought that trout were tricky and you wouldn't trust them. And we thought that maybe salmon would be very snobbish. And we created all these characters out of the fish and the things that were under the sea. And then it became the parade. By then I was teaching. I had just started teaching. I was teaching in Renmore. And I stayed doing that for 5 years there. And then I went to Scoil and I did another 5 years. And all the time I was teaching, I was writing plays for the children. And that was the other thing. I was a really good teacher if you liked plays and books. If you didn't, you were finished. I still meet children I taught and they say, "Oh, Miss Forde, you were brilliant teaching us about books." And then they never mention maths because I couldn't do maths. I was terrible at maths. So, all the people in the world from that era that can't do long division, I taught them. So I couldn't do the sums at all. So when I got 6th class, I had to get my husband, true story, to teach me the sums the night before I'd go in to teach the children. And even then I didn't understand them. So when I had 6th class, luckily, there was one boy in the class who was really good at sums. But he was as bold as 10, so you have to be very careful with him. But my trick was, I would say, "Now children, the sum you had last night, let's see, Brian," because he was the only one I knew would definitely know how to do it. He'd come up to the board and do it. And then I'd watch him and try and figure out what he was doing. But that was maths. So my teaching was a bit checkered as well. I was very good at all the other things, good at English, good at all those things. But we did loads of plays. And because of that, after 10 years teaching, I thought I'll go home and write a book for children. That's really what I wanted to do. So I went home, I took a year off school. In September I started writing. And at Christmas, Ollie Jennings came to the house and he said, "I want to go off and manage a band called the Saw Doctors, and I want you to take the festival. You do the festival. And I said, no, 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 I'm writing this book, I haven't time. And he said, no, because I am going, so somebody got to do it. So I ended up doing the festival. And doing the festival meant going all over the world, looking for stories, looking for plays and things that I could bring to Galway. So I did that for 5 years and I had a great time, but I wasn't doing much writing. I wrote a book called Tirpihon about that parade. I wrote a book called The King's Secret. And then I didn't do a whole lot. So when the festival finished, a friend of mine who I'd gone to college with, who had done agricultural science, that's what she did, Marie Hood, she was like a farmer. She rang me up and said, I've decided to set up a television company. And I thought, hold on a minute, you studied farming. What are you doing a television program about? And she said, well, that's the thing. I thought I'd do one for children, and I thought you'd write it. I said, but sure, I don't know anything about writing programs for children. And she said, you're a teacher, you'd have to be able to do it. So I did a program called Michigan's Pongar Bond, which was for preschoolers in Irish on RTE. And from then on, really, for a long time in my life, I wrote for television. And when you're writing for television, it's like being in a sausage factory, really. People tell you what they need, and you just have to make it really quickly and get it out there. So I got a job in Rossnaroon, which was a soap opera, and I was a storyliner. And when you're a storyliner, you have to think of all the stories. And then other people write the scripts for them, but you have to think of the story. So, after the first couple of stories, I was running out of material. But I knew that everybody I met was full of stories. So that after a while, my family would stop talking when I came into a room. Because they were afraid I would take what they said and make a story of it, which I did. And I would ask people all about their medical conditions and about their love affairs that went wrong. And I would pretend to be really sympathetic and interested, and then I would take their stories and put them on the soap opera. So they weren't too impressed. There was one friend of mine whose mother had a B&B in Dingle, and they came along outside the B&B and they put double yellow lines, and she was raging mad because it meant her customers couldn't stop outside the B&B. So in the middle of the night, she got her husband to paint out the yellow lines just on the bit outside their gate. So there was a street in Dingle where there was a double yellow line all the way, and then blank, and another double yellow line. So I took that story and I put it into the soap opera. So we put in anything really we could find into it. And after that, I wrote on a teenage program called Afric. You might have seen that, that's still on. And that was great fun. That was a team writing again, where people would meet in a room and decide what the stories were, and then we'd go home and write them. So I was doing all of that. Now, I kept telling everybody I still wanted to write a book for children, but everything else kept getting in the way. And I suppose partly why I'm telling you all this is, you're coming to an age now, particularly those of you who are going into secondary school, when people will start saying, you know, what do you want to do? What do you want to be? And I would say to you, relax. Because I don't think most people know what they're going to be, or what will happen. Things happen, and you just fall in with it. And certainly in my case, I never sat down and said, I want to work for Macnas, I want to do the arts festival, I want to be a teacher, I want to write books. But those things happened. But I think what you can do is leave yourself open to as many experiences as you can. Because the more experience you have, the more you know what you want to do. So after I finally finished with Afric, I went home to seriously start writing. And there was a publishing company in Spiddle called Footspatha had just set up, and they asked me to write a picture book. And I ended up writing 4 picture books for them, and a series about a little pirate girl who goes to a school for posh children. And then I wanted to write one in English, and I rang a publishing company in London and said to them, how many words in a Blue Banana book? And they said, there's whatever it was, 1,000 words. And the woman on the phone said, have you written something? And I said, yes. And I told her about it, and I sent it to her, and absolutely in my mind, magically, they published it. And that was Frogs Do Not Like Dragons. And I've written 3 books for them about that little girl. So after all of that, I wanted to write a novel for older children. So I wrote this, Wordsmith. I was talking to Des earlier, and a lot of this, because a lot of it is about language and words, and in this world, the people are only allowed to use 500 words, that's all. If you use words outside of that, you get a notch on a stick that hangs around your neck. And if you get 20 notches, you get thrown out to the wolves in the forest. Now that idea, the tally stick, came from Ireland in the 18th century when the British were trying to get rid of the Irish language. they made the children wear a tally stick. And the teacher would put a notch on the stick if you were caught speaking Irish. And then you would get a slap, I think, for every notch. I think that was how it worked. But isn't it funny? Nowadays, everybody's trying to make you speak Irish. They'd like you to speak Irish. And in that time, they were trying to stop people speaking Irish. So I borrowed that idea, the tally stick, for this. So the children here wear tally sticks. And they could get banished if they get caught speaking words that aren't on the list. So there's only 500 words on the list. And you get the list in school, and they're the only words you can have. And the person who gives you the words is the wordsmith. And she is 14-year-old Letta in the book. And her job, she's the wordsmith's apprentice, her job is to write out the words for people and give them to them in their boxes. The story happens in the future, after some terrible calamity. And the calamity is referred to as the melting. And after the melting, most of the earth has been swallowed up by the sea. There is no written word left, no books, nothing you can read. There is no technology left, no computers, no televisions, none of that. All of that is gone. So in a way, it's a bit like an historical novel. It's like in the past, people have to make their own clothes, they have to rely on whatever food is available. There's a place called Central Kitchen where they go to eat, they get their provisions that they're allowed to eat. So it's a very controlled world. And most importantly, art is banned, music is banned. And these things are now criminal offences. And people often ask you, where do you get your ideas? Where do you think of things? And I remember when I was doing the Arts Festival, one of the jobs I had to do was to go around to businesses and ask them to give money to the Arts Festival. And you had people like Kennys who'd always have a big welcome for you and give you whatever you wanted. And then you had other businesses who never wanted to give you anything. And I used to say at the time, we should have an art strike. We should have a day where there's no music on the radio, there's no record shops as they were open, there are no bookshops, there's nothing in the line of the arts that you can have, so that people would see what it would be like if we didn't have the arts. So in this book, they don't have the arts. They don't have art, they don't have music. And one of the hardest things to write in it was the first time Letta hears music and what she thinks of it. Because can you imagine if you still had never heard music and this is the first time you ever heard it? It would be so strange in your head, wouldn't it? The whole idea of it. Because it's sort of like a human voice, but it isn't. And they say, there's no better instrument than the voice. So anyway, all those things are banned. But of course, there are people living in secret who are artists and are disobeying the law. And ever so often they pounce and they put a huge painting on the street so that everybody can see it. And then the police come and chase them down. Or they might go to where people are working and play music, just so that the workers can hear it. The police in the book are called the gabbers. I thought it sounded like a great word. Doesn't it sound kind of cruel, the gabbers? And it's actually a word that the gypsies use for the police. They call them the gabbers. And if you think, do you ever hear people talking about the gaffer at work? The fellow who's in charge, the gaffer on a business site. I think that must be probably the same word, gabber and gaffer. Anyway, Letta meets one of those fellas, one of the desk critters, one of the people who are making art illegally, and she kind of falls for him. But in this bit, Letta was in the shop on her own, her master was gone, and this young fella came in, and there's something very odd about him. He came in, he's very nervous, and he's looking for words. And she goes downstairs to her master's study to get the words for him. But when she comes back, I'm not just leaving you, I'm just trying to find my glasses. I can probably manage to break them. When she comes back, she finds things have changed. He was waiting for the words. So, she's rushing back to give him the words that she's got. She hurried through the door to where she could see the counter. At first she thought the boy had left, and then she saw him. Or at least she saw his hand on the cold marble floor. His hand, and then his arm, and then his chest, and the crater the bullet had left, and the thick, red, soupy blood. And then she heard a high-pitched scream of a young girl. It took her a full 5 seconds to realise that it was she, Letta, who was screaming. Screaming even as the precious box of words fell from her hands and the cards fluttered to the floor. Crimson, sienna, indigo, cobalt, ochre, and gunmetal blue. Letta was about to run onto the street when she saw his hand move. He was alive. She knelt on the cold floor and put her shaking hand on the boy's throat. His skin felt warm and smelt of wild sage. He moaned. Letta jumped back in fright. Quiet now, she said, her voice trembling. I get help. She started to rise, but his fingers grasped her hand. He tried to lift his head. No, he said, must hide. They will find me. Who? Who will find you? The sound of a siren suddenly rent the air. Gabbers. Letta jumped up and, yanking down the cloth that covered the shop door, she slammed home the great bolts. Then she went back to the boy. Can you get up, she said, abandoning all efforts to speak list. He groaned as he bent his knees and tried to transfer his weight to his hands. Letta grabbed him, pulling him up and almost knocking herself over in the process. Put your arm around my neck, she said, her breath rasping. The blood from his wound dripped onto the floor, scarlet in the beam of light that fell from the window overhead. Letta put her arms under his arm and half dragged, half carried him up the stairs, down the long corridor at the top of the house. At one point he stumbled and fell against the old wood-panelled wall. The wall gave, revealing an ancient hidden place where Letta had played as a child. It was known as the monk's room, though no one knew why. For a second, the boy lay on the floor looking up at her, then turned towards the hidden space. No further. Leave me, here. His words were sticky, she thought, as though adhering to his lips. That kind of gives you an idea of what it's like. Letta and Marlowe become great friends and have great adventures together. The bad guy in the book is a fellow called John Noah, who started out, I would imagine, as a really good fellow who wanted to save the planet. And he really blames humans for what's happened to the planet. He thinks animals never did anything wrong. It was humans caused all the trouble. And the biggest difference between humans and animals is language. So he thinks if he takes language away from them, they'll behave and they won't do like they did before. And it's interesting. In the book I say this, that it's the only time you can take an idea straight from my head and put it straight into your head without using a knife. You can just say something and I can put that idea into your head. And that really worried John Noah in the book, because if people could do that, it could turn people against him and what he was preaching, which was all about, of course, saving the planet. So John Noah goes totally madder as the book goes on. But he started out, I would imagine, as a good person who wanted to save things.